Hi, Harry. Welcome back, everyone.
Hi.
Right. I am, as we spoke earlier, I'm Deanna Safier. I'm joined here by Harry Fear, journalist and amazing filmmaker. I'm just going to introduce Harry, and then we're going to show, if you don't mind, Harry, the trailer to your film. So we'll share that with everyone. Harry's, as I said, a journalist, filmmaker, and has particularly spent a lot of time focusing on coverage from inside Gaza, especially during the 2012 and 2014 conflicts. And the documentary reveals the mental health catastrophe in Gaza after years of extreme military violence and more than a decade of isolation from around the world, which we definitely heard a lot about in the last group of speakers' talks. So, so hi, Harry, welcome. I'm going to just share the trailer with everyone, and then we'll have a little chat. Just bear with me.
الأوضاع النفسية في غزة هي مأساوية جدا. المعاناة واسعة والحياة من أسوأ إلى أسوأ.
Trauma and grief are everywhere here, among children and among adults.
الظروف اللي عايشينها في غزة هي ظروف صادمة.
أتمنى إني أنساها.
الأوضاع النفسية في غزة هي مأساوية جدا. المعاناة واسعة والحياة من أسوأ إلى أسوأ.
Trauma and grief are everywhere here, among children and among adults.
الظروف اللي عايشينها في غزة هي ظروف صادمة.
بتمنى إني أنساها لأن الحرب هاي بتنتساش بالمرة.
الضرر الذي نتج عن الحرب مستمر.
The vast majority of Palestinian children in Gaza suffer post-traumatic stress symptoms.
وانت الحرب الجاي، وانت الموت الجاي، وانت الدماء الجاي، وانت القصف الجاي، وانت الدمار الجاي.
Well, that's apologies if we had a little bit of technical difficulty, but that was such a powerful trailer. And I've seen the film. It doesn't even do it justice how amazing it was and impactful. So thank you, Harry, for joining us. Please, everyone, can you post questions in the chat box for Harry, and I will try to get through as many as possible while we have him. So Harry, can you start? I'm curious, how did you get interested in the Middle East in the first place, in Gaza and Palestine?
Thank you so much for having me. And by the way, I'm sorry I couldn't be here over the last hour. I'm sorry for not being able to join a few moments ago earlier. Well, I started reading about Israel-Palestine, I guess when I was 17, when I was becoming politicized. Reading John Pilger, Freedom Next Time, the book, is at least a chapter on that. And I remember really the moment actually when I realized the kind of qualitatively barbaric nature of the occupation, a description of Israeli snipers killing Palestinian women and children. And for me, that was kind of, the kind of elemental moment that kind of, turned a light bulb on, and that was the kind of beginning of understanding what really is going on, and what also is kind of happening really in our name as Brits, not just because of Balfour in the history, but because the reality of the foreign policy is a foreign policy of acquiescence and of kind of secret and private support for the Israelis. My feeling over the last few days is just the same, that yes, the bombs are dropped on Gaza by the Israelis, but actually who facilitates the Israelis? Okay, there may be quote unquote Israeli aircraft, but Joe Biden thinks that Israel should be created tomorrow if it didn't exist today. and the British are also completely acquiescing in Israel's policies. So in a sense, it is a global problem. It's a problem of humanity's conscience. And the film was made in that vein to try to address the apathy of the world and try to get people to empathize with the characters hopefully humanized in the film.
Thanks for that. I can say as a Palestinian, we're always just very touched when we have people involved in our cause and our plight that are originally have nothing to do with it and choose to be involved and help. So I know we feel like that very much about all the people attending this and conference, and to yourself. We've got some very interesting questions coming through. So keep posting them. And like I said, we'll try to get through as many of them as possible. I'll first say that we are recording this event and it will be shared. So if, like Harry, you've missed the first part, no problem. We will share it and you can watch it later at your own convenience. I've got a question from Teresa Bailey. How does Harry get into Gaza as Israel knows he's a journalist and a filmmaker? Have you had any difficult experiences trying to get through?
In the mid-noughties, it was possible to go through via Egypt, which requires less kind of officialization and coordination than with the Israeli side. However, the last few trips I did working for RT, the channel, which is officialized and it is acknowledged by the Israelis as a kind of an official outlet. And so getting through into Gaza was quite straightforward. However, at the moment, and I hope you won't mind me drawing in some kind of remarks as I answer these questions about what's happening at the moment, not least because I think I will go completely crazy if I can't express myself in that sense. But just to speak about what's happening at the moment in response to the question of access that was raised, at the moment, to the best of my knowledge, at least as of last night, the Erez crossing into Gaza, which is the Israeli pedestrian crossing into Gaza, is closed. I understand that was partially because of the security situation and also perhaps other reasons as well, but also because of coronavirus restrictions. Access to Israel itself is limited. So that means that as a net effect of that is foreign journalists on the ground are almost none, to the best of my knowledge. Now, why do I mention foreign journalists? Who cares? They're Palestinians telling the story. That's true. At the same time, the presence of foreigners is a protective factor because Israel is reticent to injure or kill foreigners. And so when we had in the summer war 2014, 7 years ago, whatever, we had, I think it was more than 1,000 foreign journalists visiting the territory over the 51-day war. You can imagine the protective factor that has in limiting what happens in terms of Israel's engagement. So the fact that that is no longer a protective factor is very, very concerning. And to put that in short, in the colloquial sense, there is no one there to see what's happening from the outside world. And that can effectively change the dynamic of the situation for the worse. So that has to be said clearly. But today I understand the Egyptians are opening the crossing for humanitarian purposes, as they did in, I believe, the previous two wars, 12 and 14, for ambulances to go either way and for people to be transferred to hospitals in the Sinai. So I'm told that the situation from a kind of superficial point of view in terms of the Egyptian state's messaging of solidarity and exceptionalizing what Israel's doing is improved in comparison to previous years. So that let's count the kind of the blessings and improvements where we can.
Thanks for that. Can you expand a bit more on the role of the journalists and the internationals as a sort of a witness? You touched on them being a protective sort of blanket in that Israel does, for the most part, try to avoid killing international citizens. But, the importance of the journalists and the others as a witness. Can you sort of expand on that?
Yeah, it's a really kind of, for me, it really speaks to something which is running through the film, running through in a sense, everything that envelops the situation in the political level and the kind of level of civil society organizing around what's going on. And that is that the situation is screwed up on the ground. It's morally screwed up on the ground. And that leads to a cascading set of realities that are also morally screwed up. So what I mean by all of this is that the situation on the ground constitutes prima facie war crimes and is a moral outrage. And Israel gets away with what it gets away with because no one will stop Israel. And as I mentioned, the protective factor that Israel has full spectrum dominance of the battle space, which is how it would see Gaza. And it has every kind of technology applied to the Gaza war theater that you can imagine or even dream of. And that means that Israel knows where everyone is all the time, in shorthand. Obviously, it doesn't know where people are at a subterranean level, although it may have some capabilities to that extent. But basically, it knows where people are all the time. It knows what each building is in Gaza. It knows where everyone lives and all the rest of it. So as a visiting foreign journalist previously, your protective factor, speaking as me for a second, is to make sure your mobile phone has a power bank attached to it. Meaning that if Israel can triangulate your cell signal, then you know that you are basically safe. And it means that those within 5 meters or 15 meters of you are basically safe. I'm going back to a memory now from the 2014 war, when I was in one of the media towers that has been destroyed or demolished in the last few days. And at the time, I was one of the only foreigners in the building at the time. And I believe, my memory isn't that great, but there wasn't a roof knock on that building, but there was the fear that they may target that building at that time. This is going back to 2014. And the Palestinian sort of colleagues at the media center at the time were really quite afraid. And it's one of the kind of vignettes in my lived experience and memory that has stuck with me, because I haven't seen that many Palestinians that afraid vividly in the moment as I did then. And they said, please can you tweet and say that you're here, because it will act as a protective factor to ensure that Israel doesn't target us if they know that you're here. So I did that, at least I tried to the best of my ability. It was a late night, I was working late, and that's kind of why I was editing late or whatever. And that's why sort of at 4 a.m. or whatever it was, I ended up there. But that I think just illuminates and speaks to all of that issue and kind of what it feels like and looks like on the ground. But yeah, just to go back to the kind of the point I was making earlier, in case it was too lofty or unclear, it's an insane situation, morally speaking, that it takes the presence of a foreigner, some random British passport holder, in order to be able to act as a protective factor against civilians, against Palestinian journalists, people who had no will involved in their being Palestinian or being born in Gaza, and have their freedom to leave Gaza taken away from them. So that's what I meant really when I was talking about the kind of moral depravity of the situation at its base form, leaking out into all of these kind of other twisted moral deformities, where it kind of takes, some random British guy in order to have this kind of protective influence for no moral reason.
Well, yes, it is completely ridiculous, but while we have this ridiculous situation, we appreciate your efforts. You mentioned roof knocks. I think most of our audience will probably be familiar with this concept, this horrible practice. Would you mind explaining it a little bit more?
Yeah, just to say in terms of kind of that issue, where we are in the kind of flow of the conference, it's assumed that folks have already watched the film, because it would have been shown in real life if we were able to do this in a post-COVID or pre-COVID world. The roof knocking is a military practice where you use a kind of usually non-explosive ordnance to attack the top of a structure, a building, in order to send a message, which the Israelis have used over the last several years as a means to warn people. They also use SMS messaging as well to text residents, or they'll call up the doorman of a residential tower block, for example. And I think that's just incidentally worth meditating on for a second, because it illustrates the level of which Israel has complete informational kind of dominance about what's going on. If it can just text people randomly in a building, I bet you even the British police or intelligence services actually haven't come up with that capability, where they could just text a whole postcode area. So the level of control that Israel has in Gaza, explained by that kind of vignette into the reality of it, helps explain why technically, legally, Israel is an occupying power in Gaza, because it controls land, sea, and air. And although it doesn't have troops on the ground most of the time, it has this overwhelming military and practical dominance on what goes on there. So roof knocking is where Israel, in practice now over the last kind of several years, Israel will knock the roof with a drone missile, which usually causes sometimes quite superficial damage, sometimes more serious damage, but usually not casualties. That will then obviously, no shit Sherlock, will then wake up a family that's sleeping, or alert a family that's within the building to evacuate. And that's what then happens. So you can then in your mind's eye see the family evacuating the house, fleeing out of it in fear of their lives, and then Israel will then drop a large payload on the building to destroy it thereafter. And so it is worth just noting what this all is. That is Israel punitively demolishing homes from the air. And the word demolition is important because it's kind of the structural act of demolishing a home. It's not necessarily the targeting of the fight. If you warn someone, it's basically humans get out, we're going to destroy the structure. And this is important to just explicitly take note of what this is. This is basically punitive attacks on civilian infrastructure linked perhaps or perhaps not to fighters in Gaza. So targeting the homes of fighters and all the rest of it, or as we've seen in the last few days, targeting the entire residential block, if one person is linked to a fighting faction, 14-story building, or as we also seen in the last few days and have seen also previously, the targeting of buildings or residential structures that contain, or civilian structures that contain media organizations, because one of the studios there is Hamas affiliated, for example. So this is all quite important because it speaks to the targeting of civilian structures. Yeah, it's not military structures. And Israel has kind of pushed the limits of international law and kind of interpretation of the law when it does these sorts of engagements.
I always ask people to imagine if such an incident happened here in the UK, for example, the uproar that any one of these little acts, little in comparison to the amount of things going on.
Yeah.
Just the uproar that would happen if the British government or a neighbouring government did anything like this here in the UK, because I think it's really important not to get desensitized to the severity of each of these little incidents, the people that are involved and the lives that are involved. It's just horrendous, but
this is one of the other two things that you came to me there from what you said. The first is the question of desensitization. I've spent, kind of 10 years or something following this situation and seen the conflict there firsthand and trying to raise awareness and get information out, all the rest of it. And sort of how you show people, literally how you show or what you choose to show people. And the question of sensitization, desensitization, and the growth of viral social media, and also the fact that we're now just so programmed after kind of whatever decade of the actual social media technology, just to look for kind of dopamine hits to the brain, and how you reach people, how you really touch people, how you get people to kind of act or to wake up, more than just get the dopamine shot or whatever, or some kind of emotional effect is difficult. The other thing I just wanted to say is, you said what would happen if the British did this. The British don't in their military campaigns do as the Israelis do, specifically, explicitly. But at the same time, I think it is so important to acknowledge that Israel relies on the barbaric nature of British American foreign policy in order to justify what it does. So the British, and I know this to some people is, painfully obvious, and forgive me for having to say it, but for others it needs pointing out sometimes. The British and Americans invaded Iraq. That led to the excess death of 1 million people, using every kind of weapon you can imagine. And it's a completely different kind of conflict to the conflict in Gaza or Israel-Palestine. But in terms of defense and military factors and military methodologies, Israel and America are practically as wayward as the Israelis in a qualitative sense, if not a quantitative sense. And that is used as a justification for the Israelis. Just as, if I may say, the way, for example, we see police brutality in America is used in a sense to it exists in a sphere, in a reality that helps justify the brutality that Israeli occupation forces used against Palestinian protesters. So it's all linked. So forgive me for just stating that obvious point. I think it's so important to say, because as British citizens, we have blood on our hands as subjects of this democracy and what our country has done in the last 10 years as well.
Well, it's interesting that you say that. I am heavily involved with the work of the Balfour Project with Sir Vincent Veen, who's the chair, the patron of the Twinning Network. And there's a conference on the 25th and 26th. I'll post a link in I already did, but I'll post another link in the chat box. The Balfour Project have kindly hosting this conference on their platform, on their Zoom platform. And this conference on the 25th and 26th of May will be on the rule of law, and will focus on Britain's historic and continuing responsibility in the region. So hopefully everyone here can join us for that. It's a free online conference. It will be recorded, etc. So we've got a question. I hope I say your name right. Kirena Karmilov. Harry, wonderful film, which I watched yesterday. Are you still in touch with the young people in your film? When was your last visit there? And thank you for your vital work.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I'm still in touch. Last visit there was 2017, the winter of 2017. I spoke to some of the folks in the film over the last 12 hours, over the last few days. What can you say? I mean, yeah, it's a very emotional question. I have kind of not familial connections there, but kind of social, emotional connections. So it's life is arrested by what's happening there at the moment. I hope I can just use that question to make a couple of comments about the film. Briefly, I know we're running out of time. It's extraordinary that we have this conference today looking at this issue of mental health. I note today that Al Jazeera English is running a storyline about mental health in Gaza and the ongoing scarred for life mental and physical injuries that will be incurred by what's happening this week. It is kind of ever relevant. It is quite extraordinary that we happen to be talking about this today. I mean, it has worked. For people who didn't know, this event has been organized well in advance without any foresight about what would be the context of this event. It is quite extraordinary. In a sense, it seems like a kind of quaint issue to talk about mental suffering when bombs are being dropped and people are being killed, but actually it's not at all. It really is not at all, because the conflict as we see it raging today is a battle of wills, is a war fought primarily at the psychological level, but with kinetic methodologies. And therefore, the question of the mental lived experience of Palestinians in Gaza and the awareness of the Israeli side about what's happening at the mental level, at the collective and individual mental level, is so important to help understand what is really going on and what really can be done to stop what's happening and to bring justice. And for me, the film was made really to try to get on the historical record, what's happening, not to convey war porn or to sex up the situation, but to let the civilians speak for themselves, to humanize them, and to try to educate people's minds and hearts about the situation. And for me, an assessment criteria for the success of the film was how realistic it is in conveying the psychological suffering of people and conveying the issues related therein, the questions of hope, the questions of steadfastness, the questions of trauma responses and resilience. And I haven't yet heard someone say that it's an unrealistic portrayal of the mental health catastrophe in Gaza. I actually think that in some senses it underplays the catastrophe. And I also think, on the other hand, in other senses, it overplays. I think it is therefore broadly accurate. I think that if more features of the reality of the tapestry of reality of the suffering in Gaza had been put in the film, I think it would have been too much to swallow. So I think it broadly balanced in conveying the situation. I think also it hopefully conveys the kind of hopeless hope that is so important in terms of people maintaining resilience there and a spirit of resistance, which is something which is so difficult to define, difficult to explain rationally, but is manifest, is tangible, is real, and is evidenced by people's resilience and the fact that people haven't given up.
Harry, we're running a bit short on time, and I really want to ask these last two questions. I'm going to batch them for you so that we get them. We've got Ian O'Dwyer. Harry, I wonder if you could recommend any reading material on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Thank you. And Martin Kemp, who we heard from earlier, he says, we encounter difficulties of speaking about Palestine in our professional associations, attempts to censor what can be talked about, probably labels of anti-Semitism, et cetera, et cetera. Can you say something about your colleagues in the world of journalism, how this issue is discussed or not, and how they justify their failure to learn, fail to address the moral issues involved, etc.?
Well, I mean, the first thing is I don't have an updated reading list, but I do have a reading list with background stuff, which is still relevant. You can Google Harry Fear reading list and it'll come up, I guess. But in terms of the kind of the corrupt media sphere, I mean, humans are the virus, as we've seen over the last, a year and a half with coronavirus and our effect on the environment and the effects of that. But, journalists really are among the worst group of humans alive, to be honest with you. The problem is largely structural in terms of the media. And breaking through the media is so very difficult. And those who actually care about truth rather than career or I was going to say celebrity, but actually that's not really the word I was looking for. I was looking more for the word show business. Find it difficult to break through and basically don't exist. And in journalism, access is meaning, access is survival. So the system is not different to a political system, just with different forms of expression in terms of how journalists operate versus how politicians operate, in terms of relevance and all this kind of stuff. So it's a completely corrupt sphere. And for background information on that, please look at Media Lens, which is a British organization which exceptionalizes this media sphere and its complete dysfunction. Perhaps speaking briefly, I know we're over time now, just speaking at the practical level, journalists live in a groupthink. BBC News is largely almost identical to Sky News most of the time. in terms of its agenda, for example. So there's a groupthink is a major factor. People don't care is another factor. And people, when they do care, think that their manifestation of caring is meaningful. But they live within a naive paradigm. And so people don't see the more structural underlying issues which need to be tackled when they act. So, for example, I know we're over time, but just to explain what I mean by that, people only care, the world and the media sphere, political sphere, only care about Gaza and Palestinians when Israel is being attacked. They don't even care about Gaza when Gaza is being attacked. Yeah, it's not about Palestinians being killed. It's about the threat of Israelis being killed. This is an important point. So journalists will show what's going on, but they're not there when that conflict isn't flared up. And so they care, but they don't care. And that manifestation of them caring is just adds to the illusion of progress, of resistance, because it's the ethnic cleansing of Sheikh Jarrah, which is the kind of contemporary root of what's happening now. But how many media organizations are covering that and explaining that? Next to none, and it doesn't penetrate the global narrative particularly. So I hope that wasn't too obfuscated a point made. What I was trying to explain was that the media sphere is completely corrupted, and even at its best efforts and best times, it often misfires and mishits.
Thanks, Harry. I'm actually going to give you one last question. It's a biggie.
Sure.
From Bill Cave, regarding the war crimes in the ICC. To me, the difficulty is that, as far as I'm aware, Israel is not a party to the Rome Convention. Is there any prospect that countries who are signatories can be challenged about their inaction?
Well, I'm happy to hear the question, because now we're in the real talk territory of kind of like looking at the structural issues that can put a brake on Israel. BBC coverage is BBC coverage. It's always going to be biased towards the Israelis, but talking about these structural breaks rather than kind of reactionary criticisms is important. Now, the ICC has its own biases and pressures from the outside that create this bias. Is it kind of a white man's forum to get justice against black men? That's how people see it, for good reason. The issue is not about Israel and the ICC. Forgive me for saying that and reframing it so dramatically. America is the most powerful country on earth, and if America won't subscribe to the ICC, you can forget Israel subscribing to the ICC. It's just as simple as that. We have to be realistic, as difficult and as challenging as it is. And as I said earlier in the remarks, America provides the cover and sets the global kind of cultural outlook with regard to these factors, military factors, diplomatic factors, questions on justice and how justice can be achieved. And America dominates effectively the UN in so many ways too. So let's just be realistic about that. So it's pressure on these centers of power in America, in Britain, for example, that matter greatly. And that's why what happened in December 2019 with the election result in the UK is such a once in a generation devastation, because it was so close to creating an opportunity for some actual change in British foreign policy, which was cruelly snatched with the successful attempt to politically assassinate Jeremy Corbyn. And so these are the front lines where structural change can be achieved, which can unlock global change, which can affect the Israel-Palestine conflict and accountability for Israel. Forgive me for that aggressive reframing, but I believe it's important to be done.
No, it's a very interesting perspective. Thank you so much for that.